Hi, so this week we're wrapping up discussion of Nishime's text, so don't forget you need to read chapters 5, 6, and 7, which are part 2 of her text, Undercoveration, excuse me. And you also do have a paper assignment that's going to be due, and so that's where we're going to start before we get to what you need to be doing for the readings. Think about the paper assignment. So the reason I'm giving you this paper assignment now is because there is a little bit of prep work that you need to do in order to properly tackle this. So one of the things that you need to do is that you need to go online and you will need to select and watch one episode from the listed television shows, and the list will be provided online on Beachboard in the paper prompt. Again, most of these will be free streamable episodes. They'll be available on abcgo.com, which is, again, to watch things like Fresh Off the Boat or Dr. Ken. Or if you have a pay service, you can watch something on Hulu like The Mindy Project. You can watch, if you have Netflix, you can watch something like Master of None with Aziz Ansari. So your job is to watch one of these particular episodes, whatever you want, and you're going to write a paper about it. And you're going to analyze, discuss, and more importantly, evaluate the depiction of Asian Pacific American characters, actors, plot lines on that particular show. The key thing I really want to emphasize about this paper is that it is not a TV review, so you're not reviewing the episode. It is not a plot summary of the episode. Those things are going to be necessary in terms of writing, but that's not the entire purpose of this paper. Your job for this particular paper is to make an argument. Do you believe that this is a good, positive, negative? Is it accurate? Is it imaginary? Is it something that is, kind of fantasy? And when I say fantasy, it's something that people want to have happen for Asian Pacific Americans, but maybe is not realistic. Take something about that particular episode and discuss it, evaluate it. And part of your evaluation requires you to then pull out specific elements from that particular episode, whether it's the way that they talk, right, the words that are being discussed, the way that they dress, maybe it's the setting, maybe it's the plot lines, again, maybe it's particular conflict between parents and children or something like that you find is particularly important or significant for Asian Pacific Americans. Focus on those as your examples. But remember, the purpose of the paper is not merely to provide a plot summary. This is what happens in the episode. You have to evaluate it. And if you don't evaluate it, you won't get a good score on this particular paper. So the reason I'm giving this now is so that you have time to, again, not only pick out a show, watch a show, and again, most of these are half hours long, and most of them are Asian Pacific American themed, right, in terms of things like Fresh Off the Boat. But there are opportunities, if you want, you can focus on maybe a plot line with a significant, in a show that has one significant Asian American character, but isn't really the entire sort of purpose for the show. You can focus just on the depiction on that one particular character in that particular episode. So this is something where if you don't want to write about Fresh Off the Boat, you don't have to. So there are plenty of opportunities, and again, it's up to you to select which episode you want to discuss. Get started on it now because this paper is going to be due in 2 weeks. So, getting back to the readings. So there's several key ideas that we want to discuss for this particular week. And again, this is kind of the wrap-up for Nishime's text. So one of the things we'll start with, and this is what we'll start with in this first part of the lecture, is thinking about how does Neo, or the Keanu Reeves character in the Matrix movies, become, or can it be read as, quote-unquote, a multiracial messiah? And one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit more when we get into this particular element is that this is something that's specifically done by Nishime, right? This is not something that's necessarily written into the narrative by the Wachowski brothers, who, when they create this particular movie, have this particular idea in mind. But the idea that there's a possibility for a counter reading for this particular film. Can he be read as multiracial in a variety of ways? And one of the things we'll do is, in my particular part of it, is to think, well, how might it actually be possible to intentionally read this idea of multiraciality, even though the character of Neo is not necessarily specifically written with Keanu Reeves in mind. Secondly, when we think about Kimura Lee Simmons, which is the second chapter, Camp Kimura, for this week, is thinking about, well, what does camp mean, right? And so I'm going to give you a really, really brief kind of overview of what camp as a theoretical concept might mean and what it refers to, and how that might enlighten your reading of chapter 6 when thinking about, well, how does someone like Kimora Lee Simmons, even though she might seem somewhat ridiculous and almost a laughable figure, actually is using that particular sense of humor or parody or this idea of the extreme in order to point out these particular problems and kind of weirdness of how we understand race in the United States. Finally, we're going to go to the idea of Hapa identity as almost this kind of new identity that's created or embraced or reclaimed specifically by Asian Pacific American multiracial individuals as this kind of neither fully Asian, neither fully Caucasian or part Asian, or but this idea that it is in fact a unique ethnic identity. And this is something that is really spearheaded and embraced by Kip Fulbeck, who you see here on the right, who is a professor at UC Santa Barbara, and think about how this particular project of the Hapa Project, which he started in 2004 and is now still in process, is really about this idea of a kind of utopian notion of what multiracial identity might look like in 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years. And so one of the things we want to think about for this entire text, and again for the last few weeks, is thinking about, well, how is the idea of visibility of Asian Pacific Americans in popular culture, and also multiracial Asian Pacific Americans in popular culture, really effective in terms of making people aware of who Asian Pacific Americans are in the United States in the late 20th, early 21st century? Is it something that is actually a efficient vehicle for which to for people to understand and embrace and identify that Asian Pacific Americans are no longer these foreigners that we might have seen when we think about the idea of the model minority, but in fact part of a kind of integrated part of the United States. So let's go to Neo. So remember that, again, you still have to do the reading, but one of the things we want to think about for Neo in the Matrix film is the idea, well, how might he represent this idea of a quote-unquote multiracial sort of messiah, right? Of course, they call him the One in the Matrix movies. And part of what we want to think about is his progression, the character of Neo's progression, the progression of Neo's character throughout these three movies, and how it starts to evolve and develop in terms of being and embracing not just becoming this particular hero, but the fact that he was already this hero. He was always this hero at the start. So it's just a matter of him uncovering the reality of his own existence. So if you think about this, and again, spoiler alert if you haven't seen these Matrix movies, but maybe this will get you to watch them, is that the Keanu Reeves character at the start is not Neo. Neo is kind of his alter ego as a hacker, but in reality he is Mr. Anderson. And so this is kind of him at the start of the movie, right? He is oblivious to the reality of of life in the world. He doesn't know the existence of the Matrix yet, and it's only through his encounter with Mr. Smith, who then sort of reveals to him accidentally the reality of the Matrix, and then he then encounters Morpheus, the Lawrence Fishburne character, who gives him the red pill, the blue pill, to sort of give him the choice of discovering the truth, that he then becomes and starts to embrace this idea of Neo. Of course, what's the first step of him becoming and embracing Neo? Well, he has to take Kung Fu lessons. He downloads lessons and realizes that he does know Kung Fu. So we want to think, why choose Kung Fu? Again, a specifically Asian martial art, right? This is not capoeira. This is not, Krav Maga, right? It's not something that's, specifically European. It's specifically Asian. Of course, part is that, the idea of Asian martial arts as being more cool is part of the narrative. But yet, think, well, maybe because this is already part of it, he merely needs to tap into and access that particular part of his knowledge. We can think about how that can be read as this idea of awakening to his kind of quote-unquote multiracial identity. And this is the question about whether or not we can read the Neo character as multiracial, because in reality what happens is what's revealed is that it's not only that he has this access to these particular forms of knowledge that other people who are sort of aware and plugged into the Matrix are like Morpheus, but the reality is that he can actually shape and manipulate and alter the reality within the Matrix, that he's in fact part of this particular narrative, part of this particular universe, right? So in the suggestion that he might actually be part, of the Matrix himself, right? He might be part electronic because of his ability to manipulate, stop bullets, rewrite the code, as it were, in this particular, universe. So this is the idea. Can he, because he is this kind of hybrid, almost similar to the idea of a cyborg-human hybrid, that he is now, quote-unquote, the one, right? Is he the sort of the more kind of evolved version of what Hero should be, right, from the Battlestar Galactica series, even though this is before the Battlestar Galactica series that this is, developed. Again, this is part of the theoretical explanation of this. And of course, this only continues on into the next movie when, in the second movie, when he discovers that he really is part of the Matrix. He is kind of this, built-in aspect of the Matrix that is used to prevent the Matrix from collapsing upon itself. It's the one of these, the Neo character is something that's constantly written in as part of the kind of code so that it can then reboot, reset, and then reload, as it were, to kind of restore order to this universe and then allow the machines and the humans to exist in this particular way. That's then sort of challenged once again in the final movie when, of course, the quote-unquote pure machine or pure electronic, which is Mr. Smith, who has been the sort of the constant antagonist throughout the three movies, actually challenges and fights Neo, quote-unquote, basically to the death, with the idea that Mr. Smith is going to take over the Matrix and not only just be the program, but be the master program for the entire Matrix. And of course, it's in that fight that the idea of, the quote-unquote hybrid, multiracial Neo, part human, part of the Matrix, can actually defeat, the Matrix itself, and something that's created solely from the Matrix, which is the Mr. Smith character. So this is the idea, and thinking, well, how do we kind of read race in a way that, again, is not necessarily specifically and, explicitly talked about in terms of quote-unquote racial terms, but race becomes this particular metaphor through the Matrix movies. This is what we want to think about as you read Nishime's text. This brings us on to Kimura Lee Simmons and the idea of camp. So what is camp? Camp is really this way of thinking about humor. And again, this is something that's not introduced primarily in the 20th century. This is actually, even further back. It's the idea of humor that's used to really emphasize, ridicule, and sort of, point out the absurdity of life by exaggerating to the degree that it becomes, almost intentionally humorous, right? It's almost the idea that it's there to, point out all these particular foibles of the reality by pointing out how ridiculous things are by, again, taking it to the nth degree, if you will. So this is really what the background of camp is. And part of the issue with camp as a theoretical idea is that, well, is camp actually reinforcing these particular ideas because it's playing into these particular stereotypes? So we can think about it in that way, right? The idea of hyper-femininity, right? Camp is usually tied to things like drag, right? The idea that you wear, significant amounts of makeup, you overemphasize ideas of femininity to sort of point out the ridiculousness of femininity. Is it something that replicates these systems of inequity, or is it something that is really transgressive by pointing out how ridiculous it really is? And this is really the point of what camp is, right? Thinking about this idea of exaggeration, and more importantly, the theatricality is part of it, right? The idea that this is clearly and obviously a performance. It's not something that is meant to be quote-unquote real life, but it's something that is done for the effect of an audience, for viewership. For something, when I say viewership, I'm not just saying like, it's in television. It's the idea that you are doing it so that people can observe you and understand it. And this is the question, drawing attention to these things through quote-unquote theatricality is what camp is really about. And of course the question still is it actually transgressive? Does it kind of undermine these realities? Does it actually reinforce them? And this is the question that Nishime is really introducing when she talks with and discusses the appearance of Kimura Lee Simmons in her own reality TV shows, right? Is she kind of pointing out the idea of race and to emphasize these racial differences or the idea of femininity through these particular sort of hyper feminine representations, right? The idea that she wants to be not just the sidekick, but she wants to be the Barbie. And again, how is this a particular specific and conscious strategy of kind of drawing attention to the ridiculousness of life in the United States in terms of race and identity, and especially sexuality? So is baby fat transgressive, or is it something that's trying to make money off of replicating these particular notions of femininity? This is part of the question. Is Kimora Lee Simmons someone who's really kind of just playing into the system to make money off of it? Is she playing into the system to sort of point out and make money off it, but also at the same time undermining the system? Or is she someone who's just going along because she doesn't know any better, right? Is she really that aware, creative, conscious of her own position in society as a multiracial woman? And this is part of what the reading will actually ask you to consider and think about in more detail. So that's the end of this particular part. When we come back, we'll discuss more with Kip Fulbeck and thinking about multiraciality. We'll also get the discussion questions and prepare you for what to do for next week. That's it.